Hello and welcome to the next ghost story from the book, the Mammoth Book of Haunted House Stories. 6, 8, 10, 12, 20, 21. This is the 27th ghost story from the collection, and this is A Little Ghost by Hugh Walpole. Now, we're looking at Baldwin House at Drymouth in Cornwall, England. It's an 18th century country house in close proximity to the sea, spacious and comfortable rooms. A feature of the property is an underground passageway to the beach, reputedly even, used in the past by smugglers, and it's December 1922. And our author, or agent as it's been put, is Hugh Seymour Walpole, 1884 to 1941. He was born in Auckland in New Zealand but grew up in Cornwall, and after a period as a teacher became famous as a novelist of country life, in particular for his Lakeland saga, The Herries Chronicle, 1930 through to 33. As a descendant of the father of the Gothic novel, Horace Walpole, who was the author of The Castle of Otranto, 1764, and a master of the atmospheric tale, it is perhaps not surprising that he wrote a number of ghost stories, including 3 acknowledged classics, Mrs. Lunt, The Tarn, and A Little Ghost. The memorable account of a small girl ghost in an old house who befriends the troubled narrator of the story. And it's in just over 15 pages, and it's in it's in 3 chapters. So chapter 1. Ghosts. I looked across the table at Truscott and had a sudden desire to impress him. Truscott has before now invited confidences in just that same way, with his flat impassivity, his air of not caring whether you say anything to him or no, his determined indifference to your drama and your pathos. On this particular evening, he had been less impassive. He had himself turned the conversation towards spiritualism, seances and all that world of humbug as he believed it to be. And suddenly I saw, or fancied that I saw, a real invitation in his eyes, something that made me say to myself, well, hang it all, I've known Truscott for nearly 20 years. I've never shown him the least little bit of my real self. He thinks me a writing money machine, with no thought in the world beside my brazen serial stories and the yacht that I purchased out of them. So I told him this story, and I will do him the justice to say that he listened to every word of it most attentively, although it was far into the evening before I had finished. He didn't seem impatient with all the little details that I gave. Of course, in a ghost story, details are more important than anything else. But was it a ghost story? Was it a story at all? Was it true even in its material background? Now, as I try to tell it again, I can't be sure. Truscott is the only other person who has ever heard it, and at the end of it he made no comment whatever. It happened long ago, long before the war, I assume that's the Great War, when I had been married for about 5 years and was an exceedingly prosperous journalist with a nice little house and 2 children in Wimbledon. I lost suddenly my greatest friend. That may mean little or much as friendship is commonly held, but I believe that most Britishers, most Americans, most Scandinavians know before they die one friendship at least that changes their whole life experience by its depth and colour. Very few Frenchmen, Italians or Spaniards, very few southern people at all understand these things. The curious part of it in my particular case was that I had known this friend only 4 or 5 years before his death, that I had made many friendships both before and since that have endured over much longer periods, and yet this particular friendship had a quality of intensity and happiness that I have never found elsewhere. Another curious thing was that I met Bond only a few months before my marriage, when I was deeply in love with my wife and so intensely preoccupied with my engagement that I could think of nothing else. I met Bond quite casually at someone's house. He was a large-boned, broad-shouldered, slow-smiling man with close-cropped hair turning slightly grey, and our meeting was casual. The ripening of our friendship was casual. Indeed, the whole affair may be said to have been casual to the very last. It was, in fact, my wife who said to me one day when we had been married about a year or so, "Why, I believe you care more for Charlie Bond than for anyone else in the world." She said it in that sudden, disconcerting, perceptive way that some women have. I was entirely astonished. Of course I laughed at the idea. I saw Bond frequently. He often came to the house. My wife, wiser than many wives, encouraged all my friendships, and she herself liked Charlie immensely. I don't suppose that anyone disliked him. Some men were jealous of him. Some men, the merest acquaintances, called him conceited. Women were sometimes irritated by him because so clearly he could get on very easily without them, but he had, I think, no real enemy. How could he have had? His good nature, his freedom from all jealousy, his naturalness, his sense of fun, the absence of all pettiness, his common sense, his manliness, and at the same time his broad-minded intelligence, all these things made him a most charming personality. I don't know that he shone very much in ordinary society. He was very quiet, and his wit and humour came out best with his intimates. I was the sherry one, and he always played up to me, and I think I patronised him a little and thought deep down in my subconscious self that it was lucky for him to have such a brilliant friend, but he never gave a sign of resentment. I believe now that he knew me with all my faults and vanities and absurdities far better than anyone else, even my wife did, and that is one of the reasons to the day of my death why I shall always miss him so desperately. However, it was not until his death that I realised how close we had been. One November day he came back to his flat, wet and chilled, didn't change his clothes, caught a cold, which developed into pneumonia, and after 3 days was dead. It happened that week I was in Paris, and I returned to be told on the doorstep by my wife of what had occurred. At first I refused to believe it. When I had seen him a week before, he had been in splendid health, with his tanned, rather rough and clumsy face, his clear eyes, no fat about him anywhere, and he had looked as though he would live to 1,000. And then, when I realised that it was indeed true, I did not during the first week or two grasp my loss. I missed him, of course, was vaguely unhappy and discontented, railed against life, wondering why it was always the best people who were taken and the others left, but I was not actually aware that for the rest of my days things would be different, and that day of my return from Paris was a crisis in my human experience. Suddenly, one morning, walking down Fleet Street, I had a flashing, almost blinding need of Bond that was like a revelation. From that moment I knew no peace. Everyone seemed to me dull, profitless and empty. Even my wife was a long way away from me, and my children, whom I dearly loved, counted nothing to me at all. I didn't, after that, know what was the matter with me. I lost my appetite, I couldn't sleep, I was grumpy and nervous. I didn't myself connect it with Bond at all. I thought that I was overworked, and when my wife suggested a holiday, I agreed. Got a fortnight's leave from my newspaper and went down to Glebeshire. Early December is not a bad time for Glebeshire. It is just then the best spot in the British Isles. I knew a little village beyond St. Mary's Moor that I had not seen for 10 years, but always remembered with romantic gratitude, and I felt that that was the place for me now. I changed trains at Polchester and found myself at last in a little jingle driving out to sea. The air, the wide open moor, the smell of the sea delighted me. And when I reached my little village with its sandy cove and the boats drawn up in 2 rows in front of a high rocky cave, and when I ate my eggs and bacon in the little parlour of the inn overlooking the sea, I felt happier than I had done for weeks past, but my happiness did not last long. Night after night I could not sleep. I began to feel acute loneliness, and knew at last in full truth that it was my friend whom I was missing, and that it was not solitude I needed but his company. Easy enough to talk about having his company, but I only truly knew, down here in this little village, sitting on the edge of the green cliff looking over into limitless sea, that I was indeed never to have his company again. There followed after that a wild impatient regret that I had not made more of my time with him. I saw myself in a sudden vision as I had really been with him, patronising, indulgent, a little contemptuous of his good-natured ideas. Had I only a week with him now, how eagerly I would show him that I was the fool and not he, that I was the lucky one every time. One connects with one's own grief the place where one feels it, and before many days had passed, I had grown to loathe the little village, to dread, beyond words, the long soughing groan of the sea as it drew back down the slanting beach, the melancholy wail of the seagull, the chattering women under my little window. I couldn't stand it. I ought to go back to London, and yet from that too I shrank. Memories of Bonn lingered there as they did in no other place, and it was hardly fair to my wife and family to give them the company of the dreary, discontented man that I just then was. And then, just in the way that such things always happen, I found on my breakfast table one fine morning a forwarded letter. It was from a certain Mrs. Baldwin, and to my surprise I saw that it came from Glebeshire, but from the top of the county, and not its southern end. John Baldwin was a stock exchange friend of my brother's, a rough diamond, but kindly and generous, and not, I believe, very well off. Mrs. Baldwin I had always liked, and I think she always liked me. We had not met for some little time, and I had no idea what had happened to them. Now in her letter she told me that they had taken an old 18th century house on the north coast of Glebeshire, not very far from Drymouth. That they were enjoying it very much indeed, that Jack was fitter than he had been for years, and that they would be delighted, were I ever in that part of the country, to have me as their guest. This suddenly seemed to me the very thing. The Baldwins had never known Charlie Bond, and they would have, therefore, for me no association with his memory. They were jolly noisy people with a jolly noisy family, and Jack Baldwin's personality was so robust that it would surely shake me out of my gloomy mood. I sent a telegram at once to Mrs. Baldwin asking her whether she could have me for a week, and before the day was over I received the warmest of invitations. Next day I left my little fishing village and experienced one of those strange, crooked, in-and-out little journeys that you must undergo if you are to find your way from one obscure Glebeshire village to another. About midday, a lovely cold blue December midday, I discovered myself in Polchester with an hour to wait for my next train. I went down into the town, climbed the High Street to the magnificent cathedral, stood beneath the famous Arden Gate, looked at the still more famous tomb of the Black Bishop, and it was there, as the sunlight, slanting through the great east window, danced and sparkled about the wonderful blue stone of which that tomb is made, that I had a sudden sense of having been through all this before, of having stood just there in some earlier time, weighed down by some earlier grief, and that nothing that I was experiencing was unexpected. I had a curious sense, too, of comfort and condolence. That horrible grey loneliness that I had felt in the fishing village suddenly fell from me, and for the first time since Bond's death I was happy. I walked away from the cathedral, down the busy street and through the dear old market-place, expecting I know not what. All that I knew was that I was intending to go to the Baldwins, and that I would be happy there. The December afternoon fell quickly, and during the last part of my journey I was travelling in a ridiculous little train through dusk, and the little train went so slowly and so casually that one was always hearing the murmurs of streams beyond one's window, and lakes of grey water suddenly stretched like plates of glass to thick woods, black as ink against a faint sky. I got out at my little wayside station, shaped like a rabbit hutch, and found a motor waiting for me. The drive was not long, and suddenly I was outside the old 18th century house, and Baldwin's stout butler was conveying me into the hall with that careful, kindly patronage, rather as though I were a box of eggs that might very easily be broken. It was a spacious hall with a large open fireplace, in front of which they were all having tea. I say all advisedly, because the place seemed to be full of people, grown-ups and children, but mostly children. There were so many of these last that I was not, to the end of my stay, to be able to name most of them individually. Mrs. Baldwin came forward to greet me, introduced me to one or two people, sat me down and gave me my tea, told me that I wasn't looking at all well and needed feeding up, and explained that Jack was out shooting something but would soon be back. My entrance had made a brief lull, but immediately everyone recovered and the noise was terrific. There is a lot to be said for the freedom of the modern child. There is a lot to be said against it too. I soon found that in this party, at any rate, the elders were completely disregarded and of no account. Children rushed about the hall, knocked one another down, shouted and screamed, fell over grown-ups as though they were pieces of furniture, and paid no attention at all to the mild "Now, children," of a plain elderly lady who was, I supposed, a governess. I fancy that I was tired with my criss-cross journey, and I soon found a chance to ask Mrs. Baldwin if I could go up to my room. She said, "I expect you'll find these children noisy. Poor little things. They must have their fun. Jack always says that one can only be young once, and I do so agree with him." I wasn't myself feeling very young that evening. I was really about 900 years old, so that I agreed with her and eagerly left youth to its own appropriate pleasures. Mrs. Baldwin took me up to the fine broad staircase. She was a stout, short woman, dressed in bright colours with what is known, I believe, as an infectious laugh. Tonight, although I was fond of her, and knew very well her good generous heart, she irritated me, and for some reason that I could not quite define. Perhaps I felt at once that she was out of place there, and that the house resented her, but in all this account I am puzzled by the question as to whether I imagine now, on looking back, all sorts of feelings that were not really there at all, but come to me now because I know of what happened afterwards. But I am so anxious to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and there is nothing in the world so difficult to do as that. We went through a number of dark passages, up and down little pieces of staircase that seemed to have no beginning, no end, and no reason for their existence, and she left me at last in my bedroom, said that she hoped I would be comfortable, and that Jack would come and see me when he came in, and then paused for a moment, looking at me. "You really don't look well," she said. "You've been overdoing it. You're too conscientious." "I always said so. You shall have a real rest here, and the children will see that you're not dull." Her last two sentences seemed scarcely to go together. I could not tell her about my loss. I realised suddenly, as I had never realised in our older acquaintance, that I should never be able to speak to her about anything that really mattered. She smiled, laughed, and left me. I looked at my room and loved it at once. Broad and low-ceilinged, it contained very little furniture, an old four-poster, charming hangings of some old rose-coloured damask, an old gold mirror, an oak cabinet, some high-backed chairs, and then for comfort a large armchair with high elbows, a little quaintly shaped sofa dressed in the same rose colour as the bed, a bright crackling fire, and a grandfather clock. The walls, faded primrose, had no pictures, but on one of them, opposite my bed, was a gay sampler worked in bright colours of crimson and yellow and framed in oak. I liked it. I loved it, and drew the armchair in front of the fire, nestled down into it, and before I knew I was fast asleep. How long I slept I don't know, but I suddenly woke with a sense of comfort and well-being which was nothing less than exquisite. I belonged to it, that room, as though I had been in it all my days. I had a curious sense of companionship that was exactly what I had been needing during these last 3 weeks. The house was very still. No voices of children came to me, no sound anywhere save the sharp crackle of the fire and the friendly ticking of the old clock. Suddenly I thought that there was someone in the room with me, a rustle of something that might have been the fire and yet was not. I got up and looked about me, half smiling as though I expected to see a familiar face. There was no one there, of course, and yet I had just that consciousness of companionship that one has when someone whom one loves very dearly and knows very intimately is sitting with one in the same room. I even went to the other side of the four-poster and looked around me, pulled for a moment at the silver-coloured curtains, and of course saw no one. Then the door suddenly opened and Jack Baldwin came in, and I remember having a curious feeling of irritation as though I had been interrupted. His large, breezy, knickerbockered figure filled the room. "Hello," he said. "Delighted to see you. Bit of luck your being down this way. Have you got everything you want?" Chapter 2. That was a wonderful old house. I am not going to attempt to describe it, although I have stayed there quite recently, pardon me. Yes, I stayed there on many occasions since that first of which I am now speaking. It has never been quite the same to me since that first time. You may say, if you like, that the Baldwins fought a battle with it and defeated it. It is certainly now more Baldwin than, well, whatever it was before they rented it. They are not the kind of people to be defeated by atmosphere. Their chief duty in this world, I gather, is to make things Baldwin, and very good for the world too. But when I first went down to them, the house was still challenging them. "A wee bit creepy," Mrs. Baldwin confided to me on the second day of my visit. "Oh, what exactly do you mean by that?" I asked her. "Ghosts." "Ghosts? Oh, there are those, of course," she answered. "There's an underground passage, you know, that runs from here to the sea, and one of the wickedest of the smugglers was killed in it, and this ghost still haunts the cellar. At least that's what we were told by our first butler, here, and then, of course, we found that it was the butler, not the smuggler, who was haunting the cellar, and since his departure the smuggler hasn't been visible." She laughed. "All the same, it isn't a comfortable place. I'm going to wake up some of those old rooms. We're going to put in some more windows. And then there are the children," she added. Yes, there were the children, surely the noisiest in all the world. They had reverence for nothing. They were the wildest savages, and especially those from 9 to 13, the cruellest and most uncivilized age for children. There were 2 little boys, twins I should think, who were nothing less than devils, and regarded their elders with cold watching eyes, said nothing in protest when scolded, but evolved plots afterwards that fitted precisely the chastiser. To do my host and hostess justice, all the children were not Baldwins, and I fancy that the Baldwin contingent was the quietest. Nevertheless, from early morning until 10 at night, the noise was terrific, and you were never sure how early in the morning it would recommence. I don't know that I personally minded the noise very greatly. It took me out of myself and gave me something better to think of, but in some obscure and unanalysed way, I felt that the house minded it. One knows how the poets have written about old walls and rafters, rejoicing in the happy, careless laughter of children. I do not think this house rejoiced at all, and it was queer how consistently I, who am not supposed to be an imaginative person, thought about the house. But it was not until my 3rd evening that something really happened. I say happened, but did anything really happen? You judge for yourself. I was sitting in my comfortable armchair in my bedroom, enjoying that delightful half-hour before one dresses for dinner. There was a terrible racket up and down the passages, the children being persuaded, I gathered, to go into the schoolroom and have their supper, when the noise died down and there was nothing but the feathery whisper of the snow. Snow had been falling all day against my window pane. My thoughts suddenly turned to Bond, directed to him as actually and precipitately as though he had suddenly sprung before me. I did not want to think of him. I had been fighting his memory these last days because I had thought that the wisest thing to do, but now he was too much for me. I luxuriated in my memories of him, turning over and over all sorts of times that we had had together, seeing his smile, watching his mouth that turned up at the corners when he was amused, and wondering finally why he should obsess me the way that he did, when I had lost so many other friends for whom I had thought I cared much more, who nevertheless never bothered my memory at all. I sighed, and it seemed to me that my sigh was very gently repeated behind me. I turned sharply round. The curtains had not been drawn. You know the strange milky pallor that reflected snow froze over objects, and although 3 lighted candles shone in the room, moon-white shadows seemed to hang over the bed and across the floor. Of course there was no one there, and yet I stared and stared about me as though I were convinced that I was not alone. And then I looked especially at one part of the room, a distant corner beyond the 4-poster, and it seemed to me that someone was there, and yet no one was there. But whether it was that my mind had been distracted, or that the beauty of the old snow-lit room enchanted me, I don't know, but my thoughts of my friend were happy and reassured. I had not lost him, I seemed to say to myself. Indeed, at that special moment he seemed to be closer to me than he had been while he was alive. From that evening a curious thing occurred. I only seemed to be close to my friend when I was in my own room, and I felt more than that. When my door was closed and I was sitting in my armchair, I fancied that our new companionship was not only bonds, but was something more as well. I would wake in the middle of the night or in the early morning and feel quite sure that I was not alone, so sure that I did not even want to investigate it further, but just took the companionship for granted and was happy. Outside that room, however, I felt increasing discomfort. I hated the way in which the house was treated. A quite unreasonable anger rose within me as I heard the Baldwins discussing the improvements that they were going to make, and yet they were so kind to me and so patently unaware of doing anything that would not generally be commended that it was quite impossible for me to show my anger. Nevertheless, Mrs. Baldwin noticed something. "I am afraid the children are worrying you," she said one morning, half interrogatively. "In a way it will be a rest when they go back to school, but the Christmas holidays is their time, isn't it? I do like to see them happy, poor little dears." The poor little dears were at that moment being Red Indians all over the hall. "No, of course, I like children," I answered her. "The only thing is that they don't. I hope you won't think me foolish, somehow quite fit in with the house." "Oh, I think it's so good for old places like this," said Mrs. Baldwin briskly, "to be woken up a little. I'm sure if the old people who used to live here came back, they'd love to hear all the noise and laughter." I wasn't so sure myself, but I wouldn't disturb Mrs. Baldwin's contentment for anything. That evening in my room I was so convinced of companionship that I spoke. "If there's anyone here," I said aloud, "I'd like them to know that I'm aware of it, and I'm glad of it." Then, when I caught myself speaking aloud, I was suddenly terrified. Was I really going crazy? Wasn't that the first step towards insanity when you talk to yourself? Nevertheless, a moment later I was reassured. There was someone there. That night I woke, looked at my luminous watch, and saw that it was 3:15. The room was so dark that I could not even distinguish the posters of my bed, but there was a very faint glow from the fire, now nearly dead. Opposite my bed there seemed to me to be something white, Not white in the accepted sense of a tall ghostly figure, but sitting up and staring, it seemed to me that the shadow was very small, hardly reaching above the edge of the bed. "Is there anyone there?" I asked. "Because if there is, do speak to me. I'm not frightened. I know that someone has been here all this last week, and I am glad of it." Very faintly then, and so faintly that I cannot to this day be sure that I saw anything at all, the figure of a child seemed to me to be visible. We all know how we have at one time and another fancied that we have seen visions and figures, and then have discovered that it was something in the room, the chance hanging of a coat, the reflection of a glass, a trick of moonlight that has fired our imagination. I was quite prepared for that in this case, but it seemed to me then that as I watched the shadow move directly in front of the dying fire, and delicate as the leaf of a silver birch, like the trailing rim of some evening cloud, the figure of a child hovered in front of me. Curiously enough, the dress, which seemed to be of some silver tissue, was clearer than anything else. I did not, in fact, see the face at all, and yet I could swear in the morning that I had seen it, that I knew large, black, wide-open eyes, a little mouth very faintly parted in a timid smile, and that beyond anything else I had realized in the expression of that face fear and bewilderment and a longing for some comfort. Chapter 3. After that night the affair moved very quickly to its little climax. I am not a very imaginative man, nor have I any sympathy with the modern craze for spooks and spectres. I have never seen, nor fancied that I had seen, anything of a supernatural kind since that visit. But then I have never known since that time such a desperate need of companionship and comfort. And is it not perhaps because we do not want things badly enough in this life that we do not get more of them? However that may be, I was sure on this occasion that I had some companionship that was born of a need greater than mine. I suddenly took the most frantic and unreasonable dislike of the children in that house. It was exactly as though I had discovered somewhere in a deserted part of the building some child who had been left behind by mistake by the last occupants, and was terrified by the noisy exuberance and ruthless selfishness of the new family. For a week I had no more definite manifestation of my little friend, but I was as sure of her presence there in my room as I was of my own clothes and the armchair in which I used to sit. It was time for me to go back to London, but I could not go. I asked everyone I met as to legends and stories connected with the old house, but I never found anything to do with a little child. I looked forward all day to my hour in my room before dinner, the time when I felt the companionship closest. I sometimes woke in the night and was conscious of its presence, but as I have said, I never saw anything. One evening the older children obtained leave to stay up later. It was somebody's birthday. The house seemed to be full of people, and the presence of the children led after dinner to a perfect riot of noise and confusion. We were to play hide-and-seek all over the house. Everybody was to dress up. There was, for that night at least, to be no privacy anywhere. We were all, as Mrs. Baldwin said, to be 10 years old again. I hadn't the least desire to be 10 years old, but I found myself caught into the game, and had in sheer self-defence to run up and down the passages and hide behind doors. The noise was terrific. It grew and grew in volume. People got hysterical. The smaller children jumped out of bed and ran about the passages. Somebody kept blowing a motor horn. Somebody else turned on the gramophone. Suddenly I was sick of the whole thing, retreated into my room, lit one candle, and locked the door. I had scarcely sat down in my chair when I was aware that my little friend had come. She was standing near to the bed, staring at me, terror in her eyes. I have never seen anyone so frightened. Her little breasts panting beneath her silver gown, her very fair hair falling about her shoulders, her little hands clenched. Just as I saw her, there were loud knocks on the door, many voices shouting to be admitted, a perfect babel of noise and laughter. The little figure moved, and then, how can I give any idea of it? I was conscious of having something to protect and comfort. I saw nothing physically, I felt nothing, and yet I was murmuring, There, don't mind. They shan't come in. I'll see that no one touches you. I understand. For how long I sat like that, I don't know. The noises died away, voices murmured at intervals, and then were silent. The house slept. All night I think I stayed there comforting and being comforted. I fancy now, but how much of it may not be fancy, that I knew that the child loved the house and stayed so long as was possible, at last was driven away, and that was her farewell, not only to me, but all that she most loved in this world and the next. I do not know, I could swear to nothing. Of what I am sure is that my sense of loss in my friend was removed from that night and never returned. Did I argue with myself that the child companionship included also my friend? Again, I do not know. But of one thing I am now sure, that if love is strong enough, physical death cannot destroy it. And however platitudinous that may sound to others, it is platitudinous no longer when you have discovered it by actual experience for yourself. That moment in that fire-lit room when I felt that spiritual heart beating with mine is and always will be enough for me. One more thing. Next day I left for London, and my wife was delighted to find me so completely recovered, happier, she said, than I had ever been before. 2 days afterwards, I received a parcel from Mrs. Baldwin. In the note that accompanied it, she said, I think that you must have left this by mistake behind you. It was found in the small drawer in your dressing table. I opened the parcel and discovered an old blue silk handkerchief wrapped round a long, thin wooden box. The cover of the box lifted very easily, and I saw inside it an old painted wooden doll, dressed in the period, I should think, of Queen Anne. The dress was very complete, even down to the little shoes and the little grey mittens on the hands. Inside the silk skirt there was sewn a little tape, and on the tape, in very faded letters, Anne Trelawney, 1710.